The morning sun cast a golden glow over London as the city awakened to a day that would be etched in history forever. Streets that were usually bustling with the ordinary rhythm of daily life had transformed overnight into a sea of red, white, and blue. Flags hung from every lamppost, every window, every corner where they could be mounted. People had camped out for days, some bringing tents and sleeping bags, determined to secure the best viewing spots along the procession route. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere was entirely different from the excited chaos outside. A calm professionalism filled the rooms as stylists, dressers, and advisors moved with practiced precision. Kate stood before a tall mirror in her private dressing room, watching as expert hands made the final adjustments to her outfit. The ensemble had been chosen months ago, every detail debated and considered. It needed to respect tradition while embracing modernity, to honor the crown while remaining relatable to the people. The fabric felt smooth against her skin, each stitch a testament to the craftsmanship of the designers who had worked tirelessly to create something worthy of such a momentous occasion. Kate took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had attended countless royal events over the years, but this was different. This was a coronation. These happened once in a generation, sometimes once in a lifetime. The weight of that significance pressed gently on her shoulders. Down the hallway, William was having his own preparations completed. His outfit had been tailored to perfection, every measurement exact. He stood still as a valet made microscopic adjustments to his collar, then stepped back to inspect his work. William caught his own reflection and barely recognized the man staring back. He had grown up knowing this day would come eventually, but the reality of it felt surreal. His father was being crowned today. The monarchy was entering a new chapter. The children had been awake since dawn, their excitement impossible to contain. George, the eldest, understood the gravity of the occasion better than his younger siblings. He had been briefed extensively about the protocol, about where to sit, when to stand, how to conduct himself. At his age, he was becoming increasingly aware of his position in the line of succession, of what his future held. There was a seriousness to him that morning, a determination to do everything correctly. Charlotte moved through the palace with an elegance that seemed beyond her years. Her outfit had been chosen with the same care as her mother's, and she wore it with visible pride. She had practiced her curtsy dozens of times, wanting to execute it flawlessly when the moment came. There was a spark in her eyes, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made her seem more grown up than usual. Louis, being the youngest, approached the day with pure, unfiltered enthusiasm. He didn't fully grasp why everyone was so serious, why there were so many people fussing over clothes and schedules. To him, it was an adventure, a break from routine, a chance to ride in fancy cars and see lots of people. His energy was infectious, bringing moments of lightness to the otherwise tense morning. The security briefing had taken place the night before, every detail of the route discussed and analyzed. Protection officers had walked the path multiple times, identifying potential concerns, coordinating with local police and military personnel. Nothing could be left to chance. The family would be exposed to crowds numbering in the hundreds of thousands, with millions more watching on television around the world. As departure time approached, the family gathered in one of the palace's grand rooms. Kate smoothed down George's collar one more time, a gesture more about calming her own nerves than fixing anything wrong with his appearance. William placed a reassuring hand on her back. They exchanged a look that conveyed everything they couldn't say aloud with staff and children present. This was it. There was no rehearsal for this moment. The cars were waiting outside, gleaming in the morning light. They weren't ordinary vehicles, but specially designed automobiles that balanced elegance with security. The windows were thick, bulletproof glass. The doors were reinforced. Yet from the outside, they looked regal and appropriate for such an occasion. Staff members did final checks on communication devices, ensuring everyone could stay connected throughout the journey. Photographers who had been positioned hours earlier adjusted their lenses, preparing for the shots they knew would appear on front pages across the globe. News anchors rehearsed their commentary one more time, ready to describe every detail of what they were about to witness. Inside the palace, Kate took one last look in the mirror. Her hair was perfect, her makeup subtle yet flawless, her outfit immaculate. But it was her expression that would be remembered. There was a grace there, a quiet confidence that came from years of navigating public life. She had learned to project calm even when her heart was racing, to smile genuinely even under immense pressure. William checked his watch. It was time. He nodded to the security team, who immediately began the coordinated effort of moving the family from the palace to the waiting vehicles. The children lined up in birth order, each one straightening their posture, suddenly aware that the moment had arrived. The palace doors opened and the sounds of the city rushed in. Even from inside the secured grounds, they could hear the distant roar of crowds, the excitement that had been building for weeks. London had come alive for this day, and the family was about to step into the center of it all. Staff held the car doors open, and one by one, the family members took their seats. The leather interior smelled new, and the silence inside the vehicle contrasted sharply with the noise outside. Through those thick windows, they could see palace staff waving, offering encouragement and good wishes. The convoy began to move slowly, methodically. Lead vehicles went first, followed by the car carrying William, Kate, and their children. More security vehicles followed behind, creating a protective cocoon around the family. The gates of Kensington Palace opened, and suddenly they were among the people, moving through streets lined with well-wishers who had waited hours for just a glimpse of this moment. The crowds erupted as the convoy emerged onto the main streets, faces pressed against barriers that had been erected days earlier to manage the masses of people. Hands waved flags with such enthusiasm that the air seemed to flutter with color. Children perched on their parents' shoulders, holding homemade signs declaring their love for the royal family. The noise was extraordinary, a wall of sound that penetrated even the reinforced windows of the vehicle. Kate watched the faces as they passed, struck by the emotion she saw there. These weren't just spectators at a parade. These were people who had invested themselves in this moment, who saw the monarchy as part of their identity, their heritage. Elderly women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, remembering previous coronations they had witnessed. Young people held up phones, capturing video they would share instantly with friends across the world. George sat very still, his hands folded in his lap exactly as he had been instructed. His eyes, however, were wide and active, taking in everything around him. He could see his future in these crowds, in this ceremony they were approaching. One day, many years from now, he would be the one being crowned. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He glanced at his father, searching for reassurance, and found it in William's steady presence. Charlotte had her face close to the window, marveling at the decorations that adorned every building. Banners hung from ancient structures, somehow making the historic architecture look even more magnificent. She pointed out details to Louis, who bounced in his seat despite gentle reminders to stay calm. His enthusiasm couldn't be contained, and truthfully, no one had the heart to suppress it completely. His joy was genuine, untainted by the political or historical weight that others felt. The route had been planned to showcase London at its finest. They passed landmarks that had stood for centuries, buildings that had witnessed coronations, wars, celebrations, and sorrows. Each structure seemed to hold its own memories, its own stories. The Tower of London stood in the distance, its stone walls a reminder of the monarchy's long and complex history. Westminster Abbey was drawing closer now, its Gothic spires reaching toward the sky. William thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, who had made this same journey decades ago. He remembered seeing old footage of her coronation, how young she had looked, how the black and white images couldn't capture the full majesty of the occasion. She had carried the responsibility with such grace for so many years. Now that duty had passed to his father, and one day, it would be his to bear. The crowds grew denser as they approached Westminster. Police officers lined the streets at regular intervals, their eyes scanning constantly for any sign of trouble. But the atmosphere was celebratory, not threatening. People had come to honor tradition, to be part of something bigger than themselves. In an age of division and uncertainty, this was a moment of unity, however temporary it might be. Kate adjusted her outfit one more time, a nervous habit she couldn't quite suppress. She knew that every detail of her appearance would be analyzed, criticized, praised. Fashion magazines would dedicate entire issues to what she wore today. Designers would attempt to recreate the look, and stores would advertise similar styles. It was a responsibility she had learned to accept, though it never felt entirely natural. A military band could be heard in the distance, their brass instruments cutting through the crowd noise with precision and power. The music added another layer to the sensory experience, making everything feel more official, more ceremonial. These were the same tunes that had accompanied monarchs for generations, melodies that connected the present to the past. The convoy slowed as they approached the designated arrival point. Security personnel spoke into their radios, coordinating the exact timing of the exit from the vehicles. Everything had to be synchronized perfectly. Television cameras were positioned at strategic angles, ready to capture the moment the family emerged. Directors in broadcast trucks watched multiple screens simultaneously, ready to call for the right shot at the right second. Inside the car, the family made their final preparations. Kate checked the children one more time, smoothing down any wrinkles that had appeared during the journey, tucking away a stray hair that had escaped from Charlotte's carefully arranged style. William straightened his own outfit, took a deep breath, and reached for the door handle. The car stopped completely. Outside, palace officials stood ready to assist. The door opened, and suddenly the full force of the moment hit them. The noise that had been muted by the car's protective shell now surrounded them completely. Cameras clicked like a swarm of mechanical insects, flashes going off even in the bright morning light. News anchors began speaking rapidly into their microphones, describing every detail of what they were seeing. William stepped out first, his movements practiced and confident. He turned and offered his hand to Kate, who emerged with a grace that seemed effortless but was the result of years of training and experience. Her outfit caught the light beautifully, every fold and line exactly as the designers had intended. She smiled at the crowds, not the stiff formal smile of someone performing a duty, but a genuine expression of warmth and appreciation. George followed his parents, his young face serious and focused. He had practiced this moment, knew exactly where to stand, how to move. But the reality was so much bigger than any rehearsal could have prepared him for. He felt the eyes of thousands upon him, felt the weight of expectation. Yet he stood tall, determined to represent his family well. Charlotte stepped out next, and a collective sound of admiration rose from the crowd. She looked beautiful in her carefully chosen outfit, every inch a young princess. She executed a small wave just as she had been taught, and the crowd responded with enthusiastic cheers. There was something about Charlotte that captured people's hearts, a combination of poise and personality that shone through even in formal occasions. Louis emerged last, and his reaction was pure and unrehearsed. His mouth opened slightly in wonder at the spectacle surrounding him. So many people, so much noise, such grandeur. He looked up at his parents for guidance, and Kate placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He managed a small wave, mimicking his sister, and the crowd ate it up, cheering louder. The family stood together for just a moment, allowing the photographers to capture the image that would define this day. 5 people, bound by blood and duty, standing before Westminster Abbey on one of the most significant days in recent British history. Behind them, the Abbey's ancient doors stood open, waiting to receive them into the sacred space where the coronation would take place. Officials approached discreetly, ready to guide them through the next steps of the carefully choreographed entrance. Every movement from here on would be observed by millions, analyzed by commentators, remembered by historians. The family exchanged brief glances, drawing strength from each other, then began the walk toward the Abbey entrance, their footsteps echoing on the ancient stones. The path from the vehicles to Westminster Abbey's entrance had been covered with a ceremonial carpet, its deep red color rich against the gray stone surroundings. Each step the family took seemed to echo with significance, as though the ground itself recognized the importance of what was happening. Guards in ceremonial uniform stood at attention on either side, their uniforms immaculate, their posture rigid and disciplined. They had trained for months for this single day, practicing until every movement became automatic. Kate kept her head up and her pace measured, conscious of the cameras tracking her every movement. She had learned over the years to ignore the constant surveillance, to move through public spaces as though she were simply walking through her own home. But today was different. Today, every gesture would be replayed, every expression interpreted. She thought briefly of other women who had walked this path before her, generations of royals who had navigated these same ancient traditions. The crowd's roar created a constant backdrop of sound, but within it, individual voices occasionally broke through, Someone shouted William's name with such enthusiasm that he glanced in that direction, offering a brief smile of acknowledgement. Another voice called out blessings for the family. Words of encouragement and support that cut through the formality of the moment with genuine human warmth. George walked with a stiffness that revealed his nervousness despite his best efforts to appear relaxed. His hands remained at his sides, not quite knowing where else to put them. He had been told not to fidget, not to adjust his clothes, not to scratch or shift or do any of the dozens of small things that children normally do without thinking. It required an immense amount of concentration to maintain such stillness while moving forward, to appear natural while following such strict guidelines. Charlotte had found a comfortable rhythm to her walk, neither too fast nor too slow. She had watched videos of previous royal events, studying how other family members carried themselves. She wanted to embody that same combination of dignity and approachability. Her outfit swished slightly as she moved, the fabric responding to each step with a subtle elegance that made her seem older than her years. Louis had to work harder to keep pace with his longer-legged family members. His small legs moved quickly, and occasionally Kate would slow her own pace slightly to help him keep up without making it obvious that accommodations were being made. He was doing remarkably well for his age, maintaining his composure despite the overwhelming sensory experience surrounding him. As they approached the Abbey's entrance, the architecture seemed to grow even more impressive. The building had stood for nearly 1,000 years, witnessing coronations since William the Conqueror. Its stones had absorbed centuries of prayers, celebrations, and solemn ceremonies. The Gothic arches soared upward, drawing the eye toward heaven, reminding everyone of the divine right that once defined monarchy and still held symbolic weight in modern times. Church bells began to ring, their deep tones resonating across London. The sound was both celebratory and reverent, announcing to the city and beyond that the royal family had arrived. In living rooms and pubs, in town squares and village halls across the country and around the world, people turned their attention to their screens, knowing that the ceremony was about to begin. Inside the Abbey, guests who had arrived earlier sat in careful arrangement. Dignitaries from dozens of countries occupied seats according to complex protocols of precedence and diplomacy. Members of Parliament, military leaders, religious figures, and representatives from Commonwealth nations filled the historic space. The women wore elaborate hats, the men formal uniforms or morning dress. It was a gathering of power and influence, all assembled to witness the continuation of a tradition that stretched back through the mists of history. The Abbey's interior glowed with carefully arranged lighting that highlighted the stunning architecture while maintaining the sacred atmosphere. Candles flickered on altars and in sconces, their warm light mixing with the modern illumination to create an effect that bridged past and present. The smell of incense hung lightly in the air, adding to the sensory experience that made this place feel set apart from the ordinary world outside. William paused at the threshold of the Abbey, a gesture so brief that many wouldn't notice it, but significant nonetheless. This was the moment of transition from the public spectacle outside to the sacred ceremony within. Once he crossed this threshold, the coronation would truly begin. There would be no turning back. No pause in the carefully timed sequence of events that would transform his father from king-in-waiting to crowned monarch. Kate felt the temperature change as they moved from the bright sunshine into the cooler interior of the Abbey. The light shifted too, becoming softer, more diffused. Her eyes adjusted quickly, and she could see the vast space before them, the rows of guests turning to watch their entrance. Somewhere among those faces would be family members, friends, people they knew personally. But in this moment, everyone seemed to blend together into a collective witness to history. The children responded to the change in environment with varying degrees of composure. George stood straighter, if that were possible, recognizing that they had entered the most formal phase of the day. Charlotte's eyes widened as she took in the grandeur of the Abbey's interior, the vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that told stories in colored light. Louis gripped his mother's hand a bit tighter, finding comfort in that physical connection as they entered this enormous, echoing space. An official approached with quiet efficiency, ready to guide them to their designated places. The seating arrangement had been planned with meticulous attention to protocol. Where each person sat communicated their relationship to the crown, their importance in the royal hierarchy. William and Kate would be positioned where they could clearly see the coronation ceremony, where they would be visible to cameras but not overshadow the main focus of attention. The Abbey's acoustics were remarkable, designed centuries ago to carry the human voice without electronic amplification. Every footstep, every rustle of fabric, every cleared throat echoed through the space with startling clarity. The family moved as quietly as possible, conscious of the hundreds of people watching their progress, conscious of the microphones that would pick up every sound. Music began to play, the organ's deep notes filling the vast space with sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The piece had been chosen specifically for this moment, a composition that honored tradition while incorporating contemporary elements. Musicians who had practiced for months executed their parts flawlessly, knowing that their performance would be heard by millions and preserved for future generations. Kate helped Louis into his seat, making sure he was comfortable, that he could see properly, that he understood he needed to remain still for what might feel like a very long time to a child. She caught his eye and gave him an encouraging smile, a moment of maternal warmth in the midst of all this formality. He smiled back, some of his nervousness easing. Charlotte sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her ankles crossed, just as she had been taught. She looked around with barely concealed fascination, trying to memorize every detail so she could describe it later to those who hadn't been able to attend. The stained glass windows particularly caught her attention, the way the light filtered through them, painting the stone floors with pools of color. George focused on his breathing, a technique he had learned to help manage nervousness. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady and controlled. He knew his grandfather would arrive soon, that the ceremony would begin, that all eyes would be on that moment. He wanted to witness it properly, to remember it clearly, to understand his place in the continuity of generations. William settled into his seat, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him with almost physical force. His father was about to be crowned king, an event that had seemed distant and theoretical for so long but was now startlingly, undeniably real. He thought about his own future, about the day when he would sit where his father would soon sit, when his own children would watch from seats similar to the ones they occupied now. The cycle continued, generation after generation, an unbroken chain stretching back through centuries. Around them, the Abbey continued to fill with the soft sounds of preparation. Clergy members in elaborate vestments moved with practiced precision, ensuring that every element was in its proper place. The crown jewels had been transported under extraordinary security, each piece a priceless artifact that embodied the authority and continuity of the monarchy. These weren't merely decorative objects but symbols that carried the weight of tradition and the power of sovereignty. Kate noticed details that others might miss, her eye drawn to the flowers that had been arranged throughout the Abbey. Someone had spent countless hours selecting blooms that would complement the setting without overshadowing it, creating arrangements that honored tradition while bringing life and color to the ancient stone. The scent of the flowers mingled with the incense, creating an olfactory experience that would forever be associated with this day in her memory. The guests who had arrived earlier maintained a respectful silence, broken only by occasional whispers and the rustle of programs being consulted. Many of them wore medals and honors earned through decades of service, the metal catching the light and creating small sparkles across the assembled crowd. This was a gathering of people who understood duty and ceremony, who recognized the significance of what they were about to witness. Television commentators in broadcast booths above the main floor spoke in hushed, reverent tones, providing context for viewers around the world. They explained the history of each ritual that would be performed, the meaning behind each symbol and gesture. Some had been reporting on royal events for decades and brought that experience to their coverage, while others were newer but had studied extensively to prepare for this assignment. George's attention was drawn to the throne that sat waiting for its occupant. It looked ancient and incredibly ornate, decorated with symbols of power and divine authority. He tried to imagine what it would feel like to sit there, to have the crown placed upon his head while the nation watched. The thought was overwhelming, almost incomprehensible. Yet he knew that barring extraordinary circumstances, that destiny awaited him. Charlotte's gaze wandered to the choir, positioned where their voices would carry throughout the Abbey. They stood in their robes, sheet music in hand, ready to sing pieces that had been performed at coronations for generations. Some of the youngest choristers looked nervous, understanding that they were participating in an event of historic importance. Others appeared more confident, perhaps having performed in similar settings before, though surely never on such a significant occasion. Louis had become very still, his earlier energy transformed into a kind of awed silence. The grandeur of the space, the solemnity of the atmosphere, had impressed itself upon him despite his young age. He leaned against his mother slightly, drawing comfort from her presence. Kate wrapped her arm around him gently, a gesture that managed to be both comforting and appropriately formal. A change in the music signaled that something was about to happen. The melody shifted from the gentle background accompaniment to something more significant, more purposeful. People throughout the abbey straightened in their seats, directing their attention to the entrance where the procession would soon appear. Security personnel positioned at strategic points spoke quietly into their radios, confirming that everything was proceeding according to plan. William felt his heart rate increase slightly, an involuntary physical response to the anticipation building in the room. He had attended countless formal events, had participated in numerous ceremonies, but nothing compared to this. This was the culmination of years of preparation, the moment when theoretical discussions about succession became concrete reality. His father had waited longer than any previous heir to ascend to the throne, and now that moment had finally arrived. The processional music swelled, filling every corner of the abbey with sound that seemed to vibrate in the chest. It was music designed to announce the arrival of something momentous, to prepare everyone for what they were about to witness. The clergy began their procession first, moving in careful formation, each person knowing exactly where to walk, when to pause, how to hold themselves. Kate watched as the procession unfolded with clockwork precision. Everything had been rehearsed countless times, every step planned and practiced until it became second nature. Yet there was still something unpredictable about live ceremony, always the possibility that some small detail might deviate from the plan. It was part of what made these events so compelling to watch, the tension between rigid protocol and human spontaneity. The children sat very still now, understanding instinctively that something important was happening. George's eyes were fixed on the procession, taking in every detail. Charlotte leaned forward slightly, not wanting to miss anything. Even Louis remained still, his young mind processing the pageantry unfolding before him in ways he wouldn't fully understand until years later. High-ranking officials carried symbols of state, objects that represented different aspects of royal authority. Each one had its own history, its own significance. They were born with great care, handled as the precious artifacts they were. The people carrying them had been selected for the honor, had prepared extensively for this moment of extreme public visibility. The archbishop appeared, his vestments more elaborate than any others, marked with symbols of his office and his role in this sacred ceremony. He moved with a dignity that came from deep spiritual conviction and years of service. He had counseled the royal family, had guided them through challenges and celebrated their triumphs. Now he would perform the most significant duty of his tenure, placing the crown upon the new monarch's head. The music reached a crescendo, and then finally the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The king entered the abbey and the assembled congregation rose as one, a wave of movement that rippled through the space. He walked with measured steps, his bearing regal yet somehow humble, recognizing the sacred nature of what was about to occur. His face showed the weight of responsibility he was accepting, the burden of leadership he was taking upon himself. William watched his father approach, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Pride certainly and love, but also a kind of melancholy recognition that this moment represented a fundamental shift in their family dynamic. His father was no longer simply his father, but the embodied symbol of the nation, the head of state, the person around whom so much ceremony and tradition revolved. Kate observed the king's composure, struck by how he managed to appear both powerful and vulnerable at the same time. This was a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this role, who had worked tirelessly to understand the responsibilities he would bear. Yet no amount of preparation could fully ready someone for the actual experience of being crowned, of accepting the crown's physical and symbolic weight. The king took his place, and the cathedral seemed to hold its breath. The ceremony was about to begin in earnest, moving from the anticipatory phase into the actual rituals that would transform him from heir to monarch. Every person present understood they were witnessing history, that they would tell their grandchildren about this day, that they were part of something larger than themselves. The Archbishop began to speak, his voice carrying throughout the abbey with remarkable clarity. The words he spoke had been said at coronations for centuries, connecting this moment to all those that had come before. The language was formal, almost archaic, but it carried a power that transcended its age. These were not merely words, but invocations, prayers, declarations that wove together spiritual authority and temporal power. The ceremony unfolded with ancient rhythm, each element building upon the last in a sequence that had been refined over generations. The king took oaths, making solemn promises to govern justly, to uphold the laws, to protect the church and the people. His voice was clear and steady as he spoke, each word a commitment that would define his reign. The weight of those promises seemed to fill the abbey, as though the very air acknowledged their significance. William listened to his father's voice and felt something shift within himself. These were oaths he would one day have to take, promises he would have to keep. The abstract concept of kingship suddenly felt far more concrete and demanding. It wasn't simply about ceremony and tradition, but about genuine responsibility to millions of people, about making decisions that would affect lives, about bearing burdens that couldn't be shared or set aside. The anointing came next, the most sacred part of the entire ceremony. A special screen was brought forward, shielding this moment from direct view, marking it as something too holy for casual observation. The Archbishop used consecrated oil, applying it to the king's hands, breast, and head in a ritual that dated back over 1,000 years. This was the moment that set a monarch apart, that transformed them from ordinary human to divinely blessed sovereign, at least in the symbolism that underpinned the monarchy's traditional authority. Kate thought about the contradiction inherent in monarchy in the modern age. Here they were, performing rituals that seemed to belong to another era, yet millions watched with genuine interest and emotional investment. The monarchy had evolved, had adapted to remain relevant, yet it still drew power from these ancient traditions. It was a delicate balance between honoring the past and embracing the present, between being relatable and maintaining mystique. Charlotte was fascinated by the clothing changes that occurred throughout the ceremony. Each garment had meaning, represented something specific about the role being assumed. The king was dressed in layers of ceremonial robes, each one more elaborate than the last. The fabric was heavy with gold thread and jewels, creating weight that was both physical and symbolic. She understood intuitively that these weren't just fancy clothes, but visual representations of power and responsibility. George watched the regalia being presented, each object placed before the king with reverent care. The orb, representing the world under Christ's dominion. The scepter, symbolizing temporal power and good governance. The rod of mercy, representing justice tempered with compassion. Each had been used at previous coronations, handled by kings and queens throughout history. They connected this moment to all those previous ceremonies, creating a chain of continuity across the centuries. Louis was beginning to struggle with sitting still for so long, but he managed to maintain his composure with occasional gentle reminders from his mother. He watched the ceremony with the peculiar focus that children sometimes have, fixating on specific details that adults might overlook. He was particularly interested in the way the light caught the jewels on the crown, creating sparkles that danced across nearby surfaces. The moment approached when the crown would actually be placed on the king's head. Tension built throughout the abbey, everyone leaning forward slightly, not wanting to miss this culminating instant. The imperial state crown was lifted with great care, its weight significant, its value incalculable. It contained some of the most famous gems in the world, stones with their own histories, their own stories of conquest and inheritance. The Archbishop held the crown high, a pause that seemed to stretch time itself. Everyone in the abbey was acutely aware of their breath, of their heartbeat, of the profound significance of what was happening. Outside, in the crowds that still filled the streets, people watched on large screens, experiencing the same held breath, the same collective anticipation. Then the crown was lowered, placed upon the king's head with practiced precision. The moment it settled, trumpets sounded, their brilliant fanfare cutting through the silence like light through darkness. The sound was electrifying, announcing to everyone present and everyone watching that the coronation had been completed. The heir had become the king in full, crowned and anointed, bearing all the symbols of sovereignty. William felt tears prick at his eyes, an emotional response he hadn't anticipated. This was his father, the man who had taught him to ride a bike, who had attended his school plays, who had offered guidance through difficult times. But he was also now the king, separated by ceremony and crown from ordinary family relationships. It was a moment of profound transition, and William felt the full force of it. Kate reached over and took William's hand, a gesture of support and shared emotion. She understood what he was feeling, could see it in the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. They had both accepted lives of public service, but moments like this reminded them of the personal cost, the ways that duty shaped and sometimes constrained their most intimate relationships. The congregation erupted in response to the crowning, though their reaction was controlled and appropriate to the sacred setting. People called out traditional acclamations, expressions of loyalty and support that had been spoken at coronations throughout history. The words echoed through the abbey, hundreds of voices joining together in affirmation of the new monarch's authority. George understood in that moment, with a clarity that was almost painful, what his future held. He would sit where his grandfather now sat. He would wear that crown. He would take those oaths. The path of his life had been set long before his birth, and there was no deviating from it. He felt simultaneously privileged and trapped, honored and burdened. His face remained composed, but inside, his young mind grappled with concepts that most people never had to consider. The choir began to sing, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed almost angelic in their purity. The music had been chosen to express joy and reverence simultaneously, to celebrate this momentous occasion while maintaining the appropriate solemnity. The youngest choristers sang with earnest concentration, while the more experienced members let their voices soar with confidence born of years of training. Charlotte felt goosebumps rise on her arms as the music washed over her. There was something about the combination of the singing, the setting, and the significance of the moment that moved her deeply. She didn't have words for what she was experiencing, but she knew it was important, knew she would remember this feeling for the rest of her life. Louis had given up trying to understand everything that was happening, and instead let the experience wash over him without analysis. He watched the colors, listened to the sounds, felt the atmosphere. His child's perspective gave him a kind of freedom that the older members of his family didn't have. He could simply experience without the weight of understanding every implication. The ceremony continued with additional prayers and blessings, each one adding another layer of spiritual authority to the temporal power symbolized by the crown. Religious leaders from various denominations participated, reflecting the modern monarchy's role in a diverse society. Each brought their own tradition's perspective, their own way of invoking divine guidance for the new reign. William thought about the promises his father had just made, about the burden of leadership in a world facing unprecedented challenges. The monarchy had survived and evolved through wars, social upheaval, technological revolution, and changing values. His father would need to continue that evolution, to find ways to make this ancient institution relevant to contemporary citizens while honoring the traditions that gave it meaning. The king sat upon the throne now, crowned and robed, the embodiment of centuries of tradition. Yet as William looked at him, he also saw the man underneath the ceremony, the person who bore doubts and fears like any human, who had struggled and sacrificed to reach this moment. That humanity, that vulnerability beneath the crown, was perhaps what would make him a good king, someone who could connect with his subjects even while maintaining the necessary distance that royalty required. As the ceremony drew toward its conclusion, the atmosphere in the abbey began to shift from solemn reverence to something approaching celebration. The most sacred rituals had been completed, the crown placed, the oaths taken. Now came the moment to acknowledge what had occurred, to present the newly crowned king to his people and the world. The music changed accordingly, becoming more triumphant, more joyful, while still maintaining the dignity appropriate to the occasion. Kate helped the children prepare for the recessional, knowing they would soon need to stand and join the procession leaving the abbey. She smoothed down their clothes once more, checked that everyone was ready for the next phase. They had made it through the longest, most demanding part of the day with remarkable composure. Just a bit longer, and they would be able to relax, at least relatively speaking. The king rose from the throne, the crown now firmly upon his head, the weight of it something he would need to become accustomed to. He moved with careful dignity, aware that every gesture was being observed and interpreted. The crown jewels caught the light with each movement, sending prisms of color dancing across the ancient stones of the abbey. He looked out at the assembled congregation, at the faces of those who had witnessed his coronation, and felt the full weight of the responsibility he had accepted. William and Kate stood, bringing the children to their feet as well. George stretched slightly, trying to work out the stiffness from sitting so still for so long. Charlotte adjusted her outfit, making sure everything was still in place. Louis looked up at his parents, silently asking for reassurance that he had done well, that his behavior had been appropriate. Kate's smile told him everything he needed to know. The recessional began, clergy and officials forming up in the same precise order that had brought them in, though now the atmosphere was transformed by what had occurred. They weren't approaching a ceremony anymore, but departing from one that had been successfully completed. The king led the procession, walking with the measured pace that allowed everyone to see him, to witness the transformation that had occurred. William and his family joined the procession at the appropriate moment, falling into line with the practiced precision that came from careful rehearsal. They moved through the abbey, their footsteps echoing on stones that had been worn smooth by centuries of similar processions. George could feel the history beneath his feet, the weight of all those who had walked this path before him. As they approached the abbey's entrance, the sound from outside grew louder. The crowds had waited patiently throughout the ceremony, watching on screens, listening to commentary, imagining what was happening inside. Now they would see the result, would witness the crowned king emerging from Westminster Abbey. Their excitement was palpable even through the thick walls, a vibration of anticipation that seemed to make the air itself quiver. The great doors opened, and suddenly the family was back in the bright sunshine, back in the world of cameras and crowds and overwhelming noise. The roar that greeted them was deafening, a wall of sound that hit with almost physical force. Thousands of people pressed against barriers, waving flags with frantic enthusiasm, calling out names, taking photos, crying with emotion. The newly crowned king paused at the top of the steps, allowing everyone to see him in his full regalia, crown upon his head, scepter in hand. It was a moment of presentation, of showing the people what had occurred inside, of sharing this transformation with those who couldn't be present for the actual ceremony. Cameras captured the image from every angle, creating photographs that would appear in history books for generations. Kate shielded her eyes slightly from the bright sun, the contrast with the abbey's interior almost shocking. The children blinked in the light, adjusting to being back outside after the controlled environment within. Charlotte waved to the crowd, a gesture that was met with enthusiastic response. George maintained his serious demeanor, understanding that even outside the abbey, formality was still required. Louis had perked up considerably now that they were outside, his energy returning as the constraints of the ceremony loosened slightly. He waved enthusiastically, delighted by the crowd's response to his gestures. His innocent joy provided a moment of lightness, a reminder that beneath all the ceremony and tradition, this was still a family, still people connected by love and shared experience. The family made their way to the waiting vehicles, a journey that was much shorter than the one that had brought them to the abbey, but felt equally significant. They were different now than they had been that morning. The world had changed in subtle but important ways. A new reign had begun, and they were all part of it, each with their own role to play in the years ahead. As they settled into the car for the journey back, the immediate pressure finally eased slightly. The most public, most scrutinized part of the day was behind them. There would be more events, more appearances, but nothing would match the intensity of what they had just experienced. William let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and Kate caught his eye with a look of shared relief and accomplishment. George asked quiet questions about parts of the ceremony he hadn't understood, seeking explanations now that he could speak freely. William answered patiently, helping his son process what they had witnessed. These conversations would continue for days, as they all worked through the layers of meaning in what had occurred. Charlotte talked about her favorite moments, the music she had loved, the way the light had come through the stained glass windows. Her observations were detailed and insightful, showing a level of attention that impressed her parents. She had been truly present for the experience, absorbing it in ways that would shape her understanding of her family's role for years to come. Louis, exhausted by the emotional and physical demands of the day, leaned against his mother and grew quiet. The excitement was giving way to tiredness, the natural response of a young child who had been asked to maintain unusual composure for an extended period. Kate stroked his hair gently, letting him rest. The convoy made its way through streets that were still packed with celebrants. The coronation had given London an excuse to come together, to put aside differences and disagreements in favor of shared celebration. Street parties had been planned for later in the day, communities gathering to mark the occasion with food and music and fellowship. William looked out at the faces they passed and thought about his father's promises, about the kind of reign that was beginning. The monarchy had survived by adapting, by finding ways to remain relevant while honoring tradition. His father would need to continue that evolution, to guide the institution through challenges that couldn't yet be foreseen. As Kensington Palace came into view, the family felt the satisfaction of a significant duty fulfilled. They had represented themselves well, had honored the occasion appropriately, had been part of something larger than themselves. The day wasn't over yet. There would be more events, more appearances, but they had made it through the most demanding part. Inside the palace, staff waited to help them transition from public figures back to private individuals, at least for a brief time. The formal clothes would be carefully removed and preserved, catalogued as part of the historical record of this day. The family would be able to relax to process what had occurred away from cameras and crowds. Kate helped Louis out of his formal wear, noting how relieved he looked to be back in comfortable clothes. Charlotte wanted to keep her outfit on longer, reluctant to let go of the special feeling it gave her. George stood still as he was helped out of his ceremonial attire, already thinking ahead to future occasions when he would need to perform similar duties. William joined his father for a private moment. Just the two of them, newly crowned king and heir to the throne. They didn't need many words. The look they exchanged conveyed understanding, support, the complex emotions that came with these roles they hadn't chosen but had accepted as their duty. It was a moment that belonged to them alone, free from protocol and observation. As evening approached and London continued its celebrations, the family gathered together in a private room. They were tired but satisfied, having navigated one of the most significant days any of them would experience. Outside, fireworks would soon light up the sky, marking the coronation with light and sound. But inside, in this quiet space, they were simply a family, connected by love and shared purpose, ready to face whatever the future might bring together.